I'm Georgia and this is The Sound of Georgia. Today I'm looking at the hypothetical situation and trying to work out whether Hamilton could be two musicals. Now when I say that, I'm not talking about a completely separate show detailing all the events that didn't make it, because there's a bunch of them, obviously. And as said, content-wise, you could make more musicals just on what the man did. But that's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about whether the plot of Hamilton, as is, could be two separate musicals. Specifically, Act 1 a musical all on its own and Act 2 a musical all on its own. And honestly, I think yes. There is a huge divide in the setting of the musical between Acts 1 and 2. The double casting alone tells us that. A whole bunch of people that are very important in Alexander's life are out of the picture by the time we get to Act 2 and are replaced with a whole bunch of new people that are very important but that weren't around at the beginning. Act 1 is the Revolutionary War. Act 2 is trying to set up the country. Those are two very different events, even if they are connected. And I think if Hamilton was a book, by that I mean a novel, if Hamilton, the plot of the musical, that is, was a novel, I feel like it would actually be two. I feel like it would be a duology, with Act 2 being a completely separate book, because in a way, Non-Stop is a perfectly satisfying ending. Now, I think a hypothetical musical like this, or musicals, would work better with a fictional character, but I don't think the fact that Alexander Hamilton really existed is a deal breaker. Let's look at my other favourite thing, another musical based on the lives of real people, The Sound of Music. Let's use this as a bit of an example. Sound of Music is obviously far more fictionalised than Hamilton is. Hamilton obviously has big creative liberties taken, but all in all, it is far closer to reality than Sound of Music is. But I made a whole video about that. The plot of Sound of Music only covers about a third of Maria's memoir. And that's just her first memoir. She wrote another 4. So, like Hamilton, there was a lot that happened in her life that didn't make the show. My point is, a musical could have a whole complete story that is just one slice of a person's life. Hamilton obviously leaves out a lot, but the bits that it leaves out are pulled from here and here and here and here and everywhere. Musical's like a Swiss cheese version of Chanel's book. The Sound of Music is more like a pie, and for these two hypothetical musicals, we're talking more of a pie situation. So, plot-wise, I think each act of Hamilton could be its own separate musical. Starting the story where Alexander arrives in New York and ending it right as he's about to start his work in the government is a pretty satisfying story. There's not a whole bunch of loose ends. You couldn't exactly call Non-Stop a cliffhanger, and obviously things would have to be changed. Non-Stop might be a perfectly good ending, but you can't have the opening number. You can't have Burr come out and say in the first 3 minutes, "I'm the damn fool that shot him," and we never get to see that happen. But as I've said in other videos, I feel like the opening number and the closing number are more like a prologue and an epilogue than part of the narrative proper. The actual story takes place from 1776 to 1804. So musical number 1 could not have the opening number as it is now, and you'd probably have to have some little thing before the very beginning, that being Aaron Burr, so maybe an overture, because Hamilton doesn't have an overture. Now, as I said, I'm talking about two separate musicals. So where would we have intermission? Intermission is a little tricky, but I think the best place to chop it would be right after Satisfied. Now, it might seem to be a little bit weird having Act 1 end on Angelica when the musical's called Hamilton. Or is it? It's a hypothetical musical that doesn't exist, but Alexander's still the focal point. So it's a little weird to have Angelica doing the final number of Act 1, But if you watched my video a few weeks back, I think it's actually everybody's musical. The Act 2 musical I found a little easier to give an intermission, but we'll get to that soon. While it's not perfect, I think the best place for the intermission in this musical that is just Act 1 of Hamilton would be satisfied. I've heard here and there about people saying how they thought Yorktown was the end of Act 1 or should have been the end of Act 1 or things like that. I know when I showed my mum the album a month or so ago, she thought Yorktown was the end of Act 1. And I had to tell her it's not. But as a musical on its own, ending it at Yorktown might work. As I said, a few things would have to be edited here and there. And I think one of the things you would have to cut would be Dear Theodosia. Dear Theodosia is there to show yet another parallel between Burr and Alexander, and to semi-introduce Philip. Well, Philip's not in this musical, and the parallels between Alexander and Burr do not need to be pointed out in this way if the show ends at non-stop. So maybe ending it at Yorktown would be a good idea, but I think non-stop could still work. You just have to cut Dear Theodosia. So it would go straight from What Comes Next to non-stop. Yes, King George is still there for now. My main thing with this whole thing was whether the plot could work. So, on to Act 2. This one is a little more tricky, but let's see if we can make it work. Now with this one, the beginning of the play is actually the middle of the overall story, obviously, and because this person really existed, the beginning would have to be changed. We need the beginning to introduce Alexander, not Jefferson. In a way, I think this plot works better, almost. It's a little more complicated because we're starting in the middle, but because the end is the end, I think as a plot it almost works better. You'd have to change the opening again, as I said, but starting the story in 1789 where Alex is already in a good place is, well, a good place. The intermission for the Act 2 musical I thought was a bit easier, but it's a little sad. I think the best place to end Act 1 of Act 2 would be One Last Time. However, I Know Him would have to be cut. I Know Him would not work as either a closing to Act 1 nor an opening to Act 2, but going straight from One Last Time to the Adams administration, I think that could work. Is it sad that we have to lose King George? Yes. But as I said at the beginning, I'm trying to make this work plot-wise. I'm not worrying about how cutting it up like this would affect things like the tone or the message or whatever. Obviously, those are very important things, and they'd both be incredibly different in their respective act musical that I'm making from the musical as a whole. We're just looking at the plot. And King George's plot is not part of the main plot. And while they definitely do have value, but if the musical is still following Alexander's life, which it is, King George is not essential. For the narrative of Alexander Hamilton's life, King George is not necessary. They never met. So ending Act 1 of Act 2 with One Last Time, and picking up again with Act 2 of Act 2, starting with the Adams administration. And like the opening of the first one, the ending would have to change. Who Lives Who Dies Who Tells Your Story would work better in a story that starts when Alexander starts his position as Treasury Secretary than the opening number would with a musical that ends when he starts that. Because the opening number is full of spoilers, but the end is, well, the end. There's not really much to spoil. So keeping it would be less of a problem, and considering I do want to change these things as little as possible, even though doing that is just stupid, but because changing it up at all messes with everything. But let's keep it. It's one of my favourite songs and let's keep it. So yes, I think Act 1 of Hamilton, or at least the events that it contains, could be a musical in and of itself. And likewise for Act 2. Obviously there would be major issues and the songs as they are might not work perfectly, but the events, I think the events would. Two separate stories? Possibly. But obviously put them together and it's a billion times better. And despite this entire video, I would not change one thing about the musical. Actually, I'd include the cut wrap from Addams Administration. That was awesome. I know why they cut it. It was the first thing they cut, but it would have still been awesome to have in the final version. I would not change a thing about the show. A billion times better when you put it together, and I would not change a thing. So that's everything for today, guys. Let me know what you think. You think the events in Act 1 of Hamilton are removed enough from the events of Act 2 that it could be its own separate show? And are there any other shows that you think, hypothetically, could be split up in this way? I'm sorry King George didn't make the Act 2 musical. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my video next week. So long, farewell!